Good evening, everybody, for our last panel. That is not an academic panel, but a roundtable, which is open to the public, to the interested public. It was the idea, as everybody who has been here with us 1.5 days realized, that violence and gender is closely connected, but it hasn't been discussed explicitly on a panel. And that's why when we were planning the conference, we thought that we should have a special format for discussing gender and violence, and we decided to have a mixture of people who have an academic trajectory, but also an activist trajectory. And so we have concretely this mixture, and open. It's more or less open space for everybody is presenting his work, but there's also time for conversation with the audience, and the roundtable is moderated by Susanne Buckley-Sistel from the Center for Conflict and for Research Conflict of the University of Marburg. So, just not to take more space, I hand over to Susanne Buckley-Sistel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for introducing our panel here tonight very briefly and contextualizing the panel. And also thanks very much for inviting me for the opportunity to moderate this panel here tonight. I think we have an hour and a half ahead of us with an exciting group of people, experts in various fields that interlink around the notion of gender and violence. And as we've just heard, these are topics, or it is a topic, kind of a multifaceted topic that the conference has touched upon a number of times. I'm very, very pleased that we find the opportunity to kind of delve in a little bit deeper into issues pertaining to gender and violence. I have 4 people sitting next to me, really 3 in person and 1 person on the screen. And what I'd like to do to begin with is to introduce them very briefly. And I start to my very right, if when looking at you, to your left. We have Montserrat Zagor-Rodriguez. She's a professor of sociology and women's studies at the University of Costa Rica. And I understand you're actually currently in Costa Rica. I also understand I'm supposed to look this way when I want to look at you rather than looking at the screen. Montserrat, she's an anthropologist and a sociologist. She's also the chair of the Research Center for Women's Studies at the University of Costa Rica. She works as a consultant for international organizations such as the Pan-African Health Organization, the ILO, the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, and many more. And what she brings to this group, her areas of research and activism, are violence against women and girls, femicide, sexual exploitation, gender and development, but also feminist theory, feminist ideas, and feminist activism. So welcome, Montserrat. Great that you're joining us. Next, we have Chris Dolan. Chris Dolan is professor in global sustainable development at the University of Warwick. Prior to moving to Warwick, he worked in many African countries, or a number of African countries, in various areas, all more or less pertaining to conflict. But most importantly, from 2006 to 2022, he was the director of the Refugee Law Project, which is in Kampala, Uganda. And this is also how I got to know Chris's work. I'm very pleased that this is for the first time I'm actually meeting Chris in person, because they've done amazing work on highlighting many issues regarding sexual violence and gender-based violence, but in particular regarding sexual violence against men a topic that is highly kind of infected by stigma, in particular in countries such as Uganda, where homosexuality is outlawed. So kind of drawing attention to the plight of men in the context of violent conflicts or post-conflict scenarios, but also beyond that, is an important contribution of the Refugee Law Project. He's worked on several other issues regarding torture and sexual violence during war and conflict, questions around patriarchy and masculinities, something I'm sure we'll touch upon here tonight as well as sexual violence by armed men and intimate violence, partner violence in conflict and post-conflict societies and environments. So again, a very wide spread. In a sense, Maria, I don't really need to introduce her again, but I will do it very briefly. You all remembered the conference here started with the keynote of Maria Soquero Tabwenka. I'm sorry, my Spanish is virtually not existent. Cordoba, I think I can say this. To repeat or to remind you, Maria is professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, in the Department of Language and Linguistics. She was the regional director and dean of the Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Ciudad Juárez. She's published a lot on border and violence, and we heard quite a bit about this yesterday. But Maria also works on femicide and the notions of justice, which is why we've asked her to join us here, because Monika Hauser from Media Mondial, unfortunately, very last minute couldn't make it. But we're very pleased that we can have Maria with us here now to discuss with us notions of justice and gender. And last and absolutely certainly not least, to my right, we have Henry Myrtinen. Henry Myrtinen is currently a visiting research fellow at the Institute of Intercultural and International Studies at the University of Bremen. He worked for very well-known international organizations in the past, such as the International Crisis Group, but he also headed the section of gender and peace building at International Alert in London. Henry's been working for the past 20 years on topics that are interested and important to us here, including as a consultant for numerous international and non-government organizations. He holds a PhD from KwaZulu-Natal, and his work focuses on sexual violence against women, girls, but also men and boys in conflict and displacement. You also work on Zoji and LGBTIQ people. Another area that's only recently, or group of people that's only recently is coming to our attention in the context of gender and violence. You've done work on intimate partner violence, also on masculinities and kind of challenging hegemonic masculinities, patriarchy, and gender agency. So that's a group of people we have here. Why is it important to talk about gender and violence? As said, we have touched upon it in a number of the presentations, but also to remind you, this is not a topic that's been acknowledged forever. It was mainly due to the conflicts in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia that, in particular, sexual violence against women and girls came to the public's attention, which doesn't mean that it didn't exist before. It was just not present in the discourse, also because it's so much related to stigma, and women, girls, men and boys find it really, really hard to come forward. Ever since, it has become a very important topic. You might be familiar with the Women, Peace and Security agenda of the United Nations, and I think by now 10 resolutions on women, peace and security by the United Nations, starting with the resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and now expanding from just focusing on women and girls to also focusing in the last resolutions on men and Sochi LGBTIQ communities. But to maybe begin with the beginning, even though gender and violence has been touched upon here a number of times, maybe we need to kind of lay the ground a little bit and make the link between gender and violence more concrete. So what I'd like to do now in a kind of first round of questions is to just ask you very openly from your research, from your practical work, how does gender and violence link in many ways of answering this question, link in terms of kind of social structures, link in terms of victims, perpetrators, link in terms of forms and motivations of violence. Kind of very openly ask, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when linking gender and violence? And maybe, Henry, I just ask with you, start with you, because you're the last one to introduce.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's a very, very broad question, and I think I'll maybe start off by not talking about sexual violence, because that tends to be the issue that, as you mentioned, that was kind of one of the entry points for the UN system and for the international system to engage with gender in conflict. Was often around sort of the sort of framing of, or the focus on sexual violence in conflict. And I think that is a hugely important issue, obviously, but has led to then also kind of a loss of focus on other forms of violence, which are also gendered. And in a sense, you could also say that all violence has gender aspects to some degree. Not all of it is gender-based, some of it is, but all violence has some kind of a gender dimension to it. And I think so starting off with sexual violence, which I'll bracket up for the moment, and then zooming out a bit, and talking about some of the other forms of violence that we do need to keep in mind. That the focus on sexual violence, especially by armed actors, has meant that other forms of gender-based violence, even in conflict zones, gets invisibilized, and that's domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that occurs in conflict as much as it happens during peacetime. It happens in displacement camps, it happens in refugee centers. There's also a invisibilization of transphobic, homophobic violence that also is often exacerbated in conflict. And I think also one of the other invisibilizations, I'm sure Chris will talk more about this as well, is then looking at how violence against men is also highly gendered. There are these expectations on men and boys, especially men of particular age groups and social groups, often the young and often the poorer, to be combatants. There's a lot of pressure from communities, from families, from partners to take up arms to protect, to become soldiers, to become guerrillas, and so on. And if you look at homicide rates, for example, in Central America, the percentage of young men in places like, let's say, El Salvador or Guatemala, who are then the armed violence victims, is immensely high. But then you also, as I'm sure you will talk more about as well, there's a disproportionate impact then on women through femicides. So then also you have these gendered aspects of armed violence that need to be taken into account. And even when the violence is not gender-based or directly driven by gender expectations, you do have, even in more sort of anonymous forms of violence, gendered aspects there. If you think about, for example, the missile strike on a shopping mall in Ukraine by the Russians the other week, you would probably have people of particular genders who are more likely to be there because of gender expectations. You would have women and children at the shopping malls, because there's an expectation on women to be doing that kind of work, reproductive work, but also because men are afraid to go out for fear of conscription, as there's mandatory conscription in Ukraine. So even in this somewhat anonymized violence of a missile strike, there are gendered aspects there. And also keeping in mind that those people who launched those missile strikes, who ordered them, were most probably men. But I'll stop there and hand the floor over to others.
Thanks, Henry. More generally, when people want to come in from the panel and kind of add something or comment or ask questions, please feel free to do so. We're imagining this here as a conversation between the lot of us. But I think you, Penny, you pointed at something very important. I mean, also a form of social togetherness, agency is gendered. So gender is always relevant in any way as is space, as are other things, as is class and race and whatnot. With you to say femicide in your work, how can you relate to what Henry is saying in terms of kind of how social relations are gendered, and that then kind of causes, in the worst case, femicide? We're starting with Maria, and then maybe Montserrat wants to jump in as well.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think that, like in the particular case of Ciudad Juárez, is gender and femicide. In that sense, it's pretty much directed to vulnerable population. It's most of the time, or all of the time, that we have registered at least the sexual systemic femicide that we had since 1993. It's leaning towards a certain group of people, which mostly are poor women, quote unquote disposable women, and sex workers and exotic dancers, etc. And it has also, I think, an impact in men, like in the sense of many of the men have been discriminated also, and we don't know, and it's mostly poor men, and even though when they talk about a lot of men of power, these men of power are always invisible. So in that sense, gender goes again towards the more vulnerable in the case of the gender discrimination against men. Because sometimes we don't think that, now that you were saying that, we believe that just because men have the power, it's always they have the power and they're not discriminated. But in the case of the young, poor men, as I believe Gabi was mentioning in her talk, that they're kind of like the sicarios, and they're getting into this type of work, violent work, right? So so I think that in this sense, that's the impact that we have, and it's pretty much also stigmatized, as I was saying yesterday, to be working women from the maquiladora. And most of the time, it's there where they got the discrimination, and also in the, I'm just kind of like not thinking clear, sorry. In other social contexts, and when talking about femicide, we do have this kind of gender bias against not only poor women, but certain jobs that they have, like not only like sex workers and exotic dancers, but also maquiladora workers, or housekeepers, and et cetera, et cetera. You know? And so I think that that's this is an issue that we have been working with, but it's I think that the media did a lot to produce this type also of of discourse against discrimination against certain population in that sense.
So, in a sense, also connecting to what Henry said, I think your contribution highlights the notion of intersectionality. So, gender is always related to something else, be it age, be it kind of socioeconomic background, be it race, be it class, as well as relationality. So, when we think of men and women, we can't think of them in isolation, but always in relation to each other. Montserrat, to continue with you, can you echo what Maria is saying regarding femicide and kind of the relationality of it?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
We can hear you very well. Thank you.
Yes, I believe that, we have already seen so many studies around the world that indicate that violence is the direct result it's actually an expression of the multiple forms that inequality manifests itself. So actually we could say that violence is an extreme, form of inequality. We can see how gender subordination intersects with other categories of power and resource distribution, such as class, ethnicity, age, nationality, migration status, geographical location, sexuality, etc. So we can see here that gender, race, class, age produce what I would call the flesh and bone of the bodies whose life is at stake in the multiple context of multiple expressions of inequality. So for me, it's very important to relate violence with inequality. And we can say, speaking specifically about femicides, that in the unfolding of a femicide, it is possible to see in operation, actually, the unequal relations that exist. We can see in the unfolding of a femicide, in operation, the unequal relations that exist between the individual victim and the perpetrator. And we can also see the social relations of gender in its interactions with other determinants of class, race, age, sexuality, etc. So when we see the dead body of a woman, of a victim of a femicide, the dead body is actually the material result of how those inequalities intersected and that end up producing this context in which many bodies are many bodies resulted in extreme forms of violence or actually resulted in the way that a femicide actually builds from social relations and from individual relations. So I believe that we can study a lot, tell a lot from the ways actually bodies are found, from the ways women show signs of torture, show signs of sexual violence, from the ways that the bodies are disposed, sometimes in dumpers, sometimes in the desert, sometimes in areas where actually the body symbolizes the way these multiple forms of inequality have been actioning and have been organizing around certain bodies and certain people to produce these dead bodies or these bodies that are subjected to multiple forms of violence. I think I'm going to leave it now there. Thank you.
Yeah, and they occur. You just said that one condition that kind of worsens the situation is poverty, violent conflict, obviously also as well, and that often goes hand in hand with poverty. Chris, from your work in Uganda, I'm sure you've encountered similar scenarios regarding women and men as well. Maybe you can just bring in your perspective here as well, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Maybe I can pick up on this question of intersectionality, because I think the way the last speaker spoke about it, it's a case where existing inequalities add together, get compounded, and result in victimization. And what we see with the sexual violence against men in conflict is that it actually challenges that account of existing inequalities, because we're all led to believe that men as a group are in a position of power vis-a-vis women. And yet what we see in the sexual violence is that it's that position of power that leads to them being targeted for sexual violence in some instances. So you get a very interesting situation when you study the sexual violence against men in conflict. It's that there's a continuity in the gender norms and the deployment of gender norms. The deployment of the idea that the feminine is weak and the masculine is strong, but a complete disruption of that lived experience in the male body or the female body, particularly in the male body in this case. So, that's one of the reasons why I find the study of sexual violence against men so important, is because it does actually lead us into what I would say is a real understanding of gender as a construct. Gender as something that can be destabilized. Gender as something that is destabilized by conflict, and with a lot of intentionality on the part of the perpetrators, at least an awareness that, we need to take these people from the position they thought they were in and put them in another position. We're still living according to our shared gender norms about the feminine being subordinate and the masculine being superior, but we're going to exercise it differently and exercise it through male bodies. And so it really challenges a lot of our kind of widely held assumptions about gender and how gender operates in conflict. And I think, one of the other thing that sexual violence against men does is it makes us realize just how much the discussion about gender has been co-opted, if you like, by one set of narratives that has closed off a whole other set of narratives. And so we cannot study gender and violence without understanding the discourses and the narratives and how those have been created and how they are being perpetuated. One of the things that I have found very fascinating in working on sexual violence against men is being told in no uncertain terms that this is not gender-based violence. So when a man is sexually attacked, let me say, and let's not think it's all about rape and penetration. There are very many ways in which sexual violence can take place. But, to be told that has got nothing to do with that person's gender, I find a really extraordinary position. And then I'm asking myself, well, if it's not about their gender, what is it about? And, I don't think there is an answer to that. If it's not gender, what is it? I'd love it. Maybe somebody in the audience has an answer to that question, but I don't. And my sense is that all of these forms of violence that are sexualized are also have a gender element, as Henry said earlier. And so we have to conclude that gender-based violence in conflict, including sexual violence, including against men, is gender-based. And that's, if there's one message that I hope that people will take away from this conversation from me, it would be that don't think of it as somehow apart. It's absolutely part of the broader discussion about how gender works as an instrument of social control and social organization.
I assume that resonates in your work as well, Henry, in particular regarding masculinities and kind of homosocial relations. I
was actually going to jump in first on the question of sort of looking at gender and class and poverty and how that links to violence, and also looking at masculinities. Just thinking back to the presentation today about Mexico, about how sort of the sicarios are vilified and demonized, and there's calls for them to be burned and killed, whereas then the drug lords are sort of celebrated. And I think that there's a lot more that I think also as researchers need to do in terms of studying up and looking at the violence of the non-poor people and what they do. And concretely, where I see that is in the work that I do on domestic violence and intimate partner violence prevention, where a lot of it is also about working with men and changing men's behaviors. And there's an underlying assumption that we know who the perpetrators are, that these are poor men, socioeconomically marginalized men who commit acts of gender-based violence, of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. In part, that is true because economic stress factors do lead to domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and other forms of violence. Or there's the context in which the men and women and gender diverse persons live in shanty towns are very violent, and violence is a part of life. But I think there's a huge blind spot there to looking at domestic violence, intimate partner violence, other forms of violence committed in middle class, upper middle class, rich households. And we know that it exists, but it's not studied. And we don't study as anthropologists, as ethnographers, sociologists, we don't really study upwards in terms of looking at what is the role of masculinities, of femininities when it comes to these drug lords, for example. We tend to focus more on the sicarios and the gang members. And I think that would be something that I think we should, as researchers, look more into and look at privilege and power, invisible as violence, and the role of gender in that.
Montserrat, I saw you nodding. Is that something you look at as well and your center deals with as well? And Maria is nodding, so Maria is the next one to contribute.
Yes, I would like to say that some new social movements, like the Me Too movement, for instance, actually were able to show the participation of powerful men in different forms of particularly sexual violence. I think it is very difficult to study actually men and women from the upper social classes. We usually, researchers do not have access, to their lives, to the ways, they actually react or behave. However, as I said, a specific social movement have make visible how powerful men or also use their power to abuse other women, of course, other men. And actually, we end up, understanding how power is also related to violence, and how exercising violence against other people is actually a part of the way some powerful men exercise their power. I would like just to say that in relation to the comments made by the professor who mentioned about sexual violence against men in armed conflicts, that I agree with him. This is also a form of gender violence, and there is actually a way for other men to diminish their opponents, actually to feminize their opponents, because I think that gender is still a structure in which the masculine is superior and the feminine is inferior, in a way actually to diminish and to make those people seem weak, and actually to have an impact on themselves is actually to put them in a feminine position in front of society or in front of their opponents. So this is what I would like to contribute at this point. Thank you.
I think Chris wants to come in here.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, I think one of the big discussions in the sexual violence field, at least, is around the intentions. And unfortunately, we come from many of us in a space in which prosecutions are all about establishing intention and And so there's a kind of obsession almost with establishing what was the intention of the perpetrators. But when you work with a lot of survivors, as I imagine everybody on this panel has, what you see is you actually need to read it from the impacts as much as, the intentions are very hard to establish because very few perpetrators will talk about what they've done and what they thought they were doing at the time that they did it and how they felt and so on. But the impacts are much, much easier to read, and the impacts are definitely explained by survivors in terms of impacts on their sense of their gender identity and their sexual self and their sexual identity. And so that's another important element that I thought it's worth kind of putting on the table at this point. And another one that I wanted to raise, which is going away from the sexual violence to a certain extent, but does link back to it in terms of who are the perpetrators, is one of the gender dimensions of much conflict is around recruitment and forcible recruitment and the sort of gender composition of armed groups. And I mean, we had the presentation from Alicia about the war in northern Uganda and the militias in Rwanda, and it's clear from the graphic novels, and I mean it's a situation that I worked on in depth myself, that very few of the people that were involved in perpetrating these heinous crimes were doing so by choice. And I've worked with enough men that have been obliged to do, as in the graphic novel, to cut off a hand or to penetrate somebody completely against their will, as the person doing the penetrating. They didn't want to do it, but they had to do it or they would be killed. To see exactly how damaging that is to the people who've been forced to perpetrate, ostensibly to perpetrate. So if you took a video of them at the moment when it was happening, you'd say they're the perpetrator. But if you actually take a little moment just to understand how did they get into that place where they had to do those things, they're actually victims. And what that leaves us with is that in very many armed conflicts, the majority of the people we see as perpetrators are actually themselves victims. And the majority of those victims are male-bodied at least. So that's another complication I think we need to bring into this discussion about gender and violence, because I think it's actually a massive complication. It's not a minor one. It's not a nuance. It's absolutely fundamental to how we should begin to think about the connection between gender and violence, because it's across formal and informal armed groups. So I don't know what my colleagues around the table would have to say on that, but to me it's something that I have grappled with. It's something that I struggle with in terms of the dominant narratives, which just assume that, like, okay, so you've got some kind of a uniform on, that you chose that, and therefore whatever you did while wearing that uniform was intentional, and therefore you're a perpetrator. And of course, we all know that when it gets into prosecutions and so on, certainly at national level, they focus on the low-level perpetrators who are easy to attack, not the top guys who've given the orders. I'm starting to ramble, but
I do agree with you, because I think that many times we're not here kind of like to forgive the perpetrators, and we don't know their stories, as you were saying. And one day I was at a conference in Juarez, and Professor Maria Jesus Izquierdo was mentioning something like, we do need to forgive them. And everybody was just kind of like enraged because of that. But we really don't know their stories. And of course, there are perpetrators which do not deserve forgiveness, I guess. But in many cases, as you were mentioning, I think that they do, because they're being forced to do it. And sometimes when you say, well, they don't have a choice, but if the choice is between life and death, many times they're going to choose to leave. Even with the other choices to kill your best friend or somebody in your family or whatever. But you also carry that guilt, I think. And then just going back a little bit to what you were saying about violence on the upper level classes, we do have I agree with Montserrat that many times we don't have the access, and many times they don't give you access because it's shameful. Because violence, exercise violence, in the lower classes or the more impoverished people, it's kind of like natural, quote unquote, and we're kind of like used to see it. And that's part of the narrative. And everything's fine over here. And but a lot of times the violence might be not physical, but can be economic a lot of times, and many times it's psychological. So I think that we're also dealing with different types of violence here.
Kind of agree that northern Uganda is a very important case when it comes to questioning the dichotomy between victims and perpetrators. There is a study by Tim Williams, it was his PhD dissertation, on how and why ordinary people participate in genocide, and one of his findings was that even though we think there is no way out, often there is. So sometimes this is an advice when you're ever caught up in a situation of genocide, just go home, keep quiet. In northern Uganda, that was an option because people couldn't go home. But we also, I think, sometimes have to question this narrative of I was forced, I couldn't do anything else. And then it depends on the particular case, and I would definitely exclude northern Uganda. But I think in Rwanda, people were able not to contribute, and some people didn't participate in genocide or sexual violence during the 1994 genocide. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm certainly not trying to say that all men are victims by any means, but I'm saying that there are far larger numbers than are generally recognized because we have these stereotypes about who sits in which positions and what are those positions associated with. So I do think it needs a lot of interrogation. And I think the other, and maybe we're coming to solutions a bit early, I know we're supposed to discuss solutions, but I think one of the problems we have in this field is that because we fail to really dissect properly where the victimization lies, or we fail to dissect it comprehensively, let me say it comprehensively. And so we miss out a whole bunch of people who have been victimized and therefore carry their trauma with them. They carry it into their family lives, they carry it into their intimate partner relations, they carry it into their exclusion from ordinary social processes. It then gets transmitted, gets transgenerational transmission. And if we're really interested in breaking cycles of violence, we have to get to grips with all of that, because otherwise we're just leaving this huge mass of trouble unaddressed. And I've been working on this for quite a long time, and I just see an almost total absence of a willingness, I would say, because to me it's a political issue, a political willingness to grapple with that complexity.
I think this is a good transition. Henry wanted to come in, maybe Henry wanted to come in on something else, but as he happens to advise international organizations on that matter, maybe you can also pick up on the what to do.
I'll kind of jump in quickly first on the issue of sort of victims and perpetrators, and I think it is hugely problematic that we do have this dichotomous view of the world and try to then sort of force the reality into this binary system that just doesn't, for the most part, doesn't work. I think that there's just complicate things a bit further, and those kinds of kill or be killed situations absolutely do exist, or kill someone or have your hand chopped off, where there's not much choice to do something. But I think it's also interesting to look at the way gender also plays a role in situations where it's less drastic. And and Chris, you're absolutely right, there's very little perpetrator research, but where there is perpetrator research, for example, on Germans during the Third Reich, German soldiers, or American soldiers in Vietnam committing atrocities, oftentimes it's not a kill or be killed situation, and it's not even a kill or be demoted, not a kill or be kicked out of the army. It was usually always an option for the US soldiers, for the German soldiers, for German police officers to not participate in massacres. But oftentimes they did because they feared letting down the group, and that's where sort of the issue of what you mentioned earlier, the word homosociality comes in, this band of brothers sense that I need to be there for my buddies, and if I don't participate in this, if I don't go with a group, I'm letting them down. And it can be in sort of very small things like making sexist jokes and laughing along, to then sort of participating in sexual violence, participating in sexualized torture, participating in massacres, because you don't want to let the group down. And I think a lot of that also has to then do with masculine sense of belonging and identity to that small group, not necessarily to an ideological cause, but to that small group that you're deployed with. But maybe I'll stop there and then come back to working on masculinities later, just in case somebody wants to jump in on.
Yeah, Montserrat? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I would like to say something about that. There is an anthropologist from Latin America, Rita Segato, that says that violent crimes are not only instrumental, that they are always expressive. And that in that sense, also this type of crimes send a message to peers, to society in general, to other people. So I think we also have to take into consideration, the ways in which violent crimes, send messages, or people who commit them use them, as an instrument for communicating power, for communicating control, for communicating other things. And I think this is a very important analysis that we have to take into consideration. And the other thing is that I think we have to differentiate what we call in Central America scenarios. I think it is different, the scenario of armed conflicts, the scenarios caused by criminal activities, and also the household. If we analyze gender-based crimes as if they were the same in those scenarios, of course, we are not taking into consideration the context. And the context is very important to understand violence, to understand motivations, to understand differential relations of power. I mean, it is not the same a man that is the king of the household and a woman that doesn't even have a job, that doesn't have a place to go, that doesn't have family to support her, as there is in a scenario in which, let's say, the criminal gangs act, and use violence as a rite of passage. So I think violence as expressive crimes also tell different things in different scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks for kind of showing the multifaceted aspects of scenarios. It kind of makes it even more complicated for us to turn now to the question, where do we go from here? Or, I mean, we're not the first people thinking about these issues. I know Henry's done some work on it, more practical, probably others as well. Maria, I don't know whether in your work you also consider options of reducing the cycle of violence. if you feel put on the spot, this is not the whiskey, but if you feel put on the spot, we can continue with other people as well. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to come in as well.
Could somebody else?
Yeah, Henry. Or, I don't know, Montserrat, do you want to jump in here, or Chris does?
If I may, I think, one of the kind of dominant stories at the moment is that we need to engage men and boys in addressing violence against women and girls. And, I think I always say, like, why engaging? It just sounds like the assumption there is that there's this homogeneous block of men and boys that don't have any problems themselves, other than the fact that they're not very nice people when it comes to how they interact with women and girls. And I think that, to me, I don't get it. Like, if you're going to then go and work with those men and boys, and that's your starting point, you've failed before you've even opened your mouth. But that is the dominant framework for what do we need to do about addressing gender-based violence against women and girls. Whereas my starting point would be, can you start by asking those men and boys what their own positionality is and how their own gender impacts on their lives, and start from there. And sure, you will find those ones who are, utterly privileged. I've met some myself, and who have never felt troubled, and they've never felt that their gender puts them at a disadvantage. But you'll find plenty more who will say, well, actually, me being a man, I'm expected to do this, this, and this, but the reality is I can't do it. I mean, working with refugees, I have done for most of my career, I've hardly ever come across a refugee man who is in a position of privilege and power. Quite the opposite. I've come across some who were in those positions and still are trying to, exercise their habitual kind of presence, and it doesn't work. But nearly everybody else, they gave up those pretensions a long time ago, and they're now absolutely disempowered. And of course, you can have Schadenfreude and just look at them and think, oh, isn't it great that they finally had their comeuppance, and now they can feel what it's like to be at a disadvantage and to be disempowered. But frankly, that doesn't get you very far if you're trying to help a community and a society through an experience of mass violence and destruction. So I think we have to turn this whole discussion on its head in that sense.
But maybe it's not just losing privileges, but also being privileged, and it brings us back to intimate partner violence. And maybe, Montserrat, you want to come in, because you said earlier that the Me Too initiative was one way of kind of women speaking back in the context of kind of unequal gender relations in kind of a more workplace or at home. And then that goes with the privilege of men. Weinstein, what's his name? I don't think he did consider at any point be underprivileged.
Yes, thank you. I think that if I believe that violence is the tie that binds the different forms of inequality, we have to address the different forms of inequality in society. And I am not willing just yet to stop saying that gender inequality, the difference in power between men and women, are not important when we address the issue of gender-based violence. I think that is essential. I am not saying that all women are the same and that all men are the same. I am saying, however, that there is a gender structure that puts women into certain positions and puts men into certain other positions, most of the time in most privileged positions. When we compare, of course, with women from the same class, from the same ethnicity, from the same local region, etc. So I think we also need to address the huge difference of power between men and women, and we have to address all the different forms of inequality. I do believe that probably gender socialization is important and that we could address some individual issues, and we should, of course, work with both men, women, and teenagers, and girls and boys on an individual basis. But I also believe that if we do not address the structural causes of these forms of inequality, the structural causes of these forms of violence, there is little that what we can do in terms of of changing individual behaviors or worldviews or attitudes. I believe that the most fundamental issue is try to find a way to address the different forms of structural inequalities.
I assume, but do not know, that it resonates with your work, Henry, as well.
So I think some of the ways and the most successful models that I've seen do try to address sort of multiple different levels of inequality and stress factors that add up to, this is looking at sort of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, that add up to that situation that leads to domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And I think the most successful ones are contextualized. So they really draw on the situation in which the men and women and persons of other gender identities find themselves in, and are responsive to that. And that there's not going to be a silver bullet, one-size-fits-all model. As I mentioned earlier, and as others have mentioned as well, a lot of this work really does focus on socioeconomically more marginalized groups, so they wouldn't necessarily work for Harvey Weinstein or others, because there isn't a economic stress factor there, for example, that would need to be addressed. But so some of the most successful models, and there's a number of them, and a lot of them do come from different African contexts, from South Africa and Gambia and Uganda, and also Latin American contexts, try to kind of look at different elements simultaneously. And one is looking at gender norms and gendered behaviors. One is looking at the making sure that there is some kind of economic empowerment element to it to reduce that stress factor that does lead to violence, to anger, to anxiety, and so on. Addressing food insecurity, for example, as well, which is also a contributing factor to violence. And it needs to be something that is as comprehensive as possible. It cannot just be about telling one person, like, you. It's a bit unfair to pick on them, because they actually did have quite a comprehensive approach. But a South African organization had the slogan, "One man can," and often one man can't. Even though they do want, even if they would be willing to change, they will face ridicule from their peers. They will face opposition from family members. They might even their partner might be saying, "You're embarrassing me by helping me out with the household work." So it does need to be something where the individual change is supported by community level change, family level change on gender norms. And I think, again, sort of coming back to something I think, Susanna, you mentioned, is gender is relational. That, for example, in the work that I've been doing in Central Asia on domestic violence prevention, one of the key issues that we're trying to address there is working with mothers-in-law who influence their sons and tell their sons to control their women, so to say, for the sake of family respectability. So we need to work with the wives, we need to work with the husbands, but we also need to work with the parents of the husbands and with other community members. So comprehensive, contextualized, trying to look at different levels of inequality simultaneously. It's not easy work, but I think it's worth doing.
I would open the floor for questions or comments to any of our speakers. There's 1, 2, 3. Where are the microphone people? Are the microphone people still around? Behind you, there's somebody.
I know you mentioned already the complexity of gender and violence on gender and non-violence, but shouldn't we also include in the discussion what Maria Lugones called the coloniality of gender? So the repercussions today, and when we discuss also, for example, what Sylvia Tamale discussed in her recent publication, Decolonization and Afrofeminism. So that I think it's important because we also have to discuss what gender constructions researchers, aid workers have in mind. And I remember that Henry mentioned in a report that often aid workers or those who make the concepts of gender programs are not able to recognize the multiple relations of families in certain contexts because they have this in mind of a nuclear family, a man and a man and a woman, but now it can also be two men or two women. So it has repercussions what aid workers and also those who make the concepts of gender programs, and it leads to particular imaginations of change and how do we include those who live in particular regions, what they think about how gender orders should change.
Thanks. I propose we take more questions and then each person on the panel can respond. There was a question here and here and here, so let's 4 together and then we do a second round later.
I was wondering when you are talking about gender, how the definition of the conceptualization of the term is localizing women and men. I believe that the transsexual movement has teach us a lot of things about the importance to break our traditional or anquilosadas conceptions about the identity. Another problem that I am listening in this moment is that the violence is heterosexualized, because you are talking only in this part. And gender is more than women and men. Gender is generation, and we need to talk about how is how is going on with the children and the older people that is under the care of women. And we need to know why the cuidado, the care is in a victim. If we understand the logic that we are talking about violence in this moment, why we have a lot of problem with the generation. Gender and generation is related to. Another thing I want to say that we need to put off the violence from the psychology. As my experience with working with women and youth that were surviving from sexual violence, the point more important was not the psychology, was the sociology, was the community, was the political influence. Because always in this perspective, we are not resolving the problems, the pain that violence is generating in our lives.
Thank you. There was a comment here. or question?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to ask something about what Chris said with the who should be named the victim. And I would like to know, I don't know if you have an answer, but I would like to think about what would be a way to deal with this kind of perpetrators who are also victims. How is there a possibility of I don't know, convivencia between victim survivors and victim perpetrators, and how could this look like? Because we just talked about how we could prevent this violence, but this violence is existing and the survivors have to deal with it, and what could be a way to deal with it. And also we have to differentiate between war and non-war settings, and how and I would also like to ask how the discussion in the feminist movements and the LGBTQI plus movements look like, because there are many victim survivors of sexual and gender-based violence.
Thank you. And there's a last question all the way over there, and then we give the audience panel the opportunity to respond.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your interesting and debate and from different perspectives. And I was wondering, or my general impression is that we mostly think about men as perpetrators when we talk about gender-based violence, although there are forms of gender-based violence being perpetrated by women. And so I'm sorry for that binary perspective I'm bringing in. I'm sorry, because I'm with you and find it really interesting, your comment. And yes, for example, genital mutilation is it comes to my mind, and I would ask you if you maybe could share a spot on it. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we start with Henry first. I mean, just go the reverse. Maria, would you like to start with the questions?
Well, I do agree that we have been just kind of like getting into just thinking of gender on a binary position, and it has to go beyond. I think that we talk about a little bit when Henry mentioned something at the beginning, and when I was talking about femicide, I was going to say that we also need to know, because like in Juarez, we really don't know who's killing the women. At least we don't have any evidence of the first years, as I was mentioning yesterday, who the perpetrators are. We don't even know if there are women who are killing the women, or if there are women that are participating in the acts of violence against these other women. And I think that we haven't gotten to really go into what gender is, or to rethink about what gender is in this sense, right?
Chris, do you want to continue, or?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on the various questions. I mean, one is about the decolonization. I mean, I think it's really unfortunate, but the gender discourse itself has been a very colonial one, and or a neo-colonial one, let me say, and it continues to be like that. Certainly, if you're looking at it from the ground upwards. I totally agree with the second speaker about the the question of, like we're not stuck with the binary, but it is quite challenging to move beyond the binary in the discussion. In the communities I've worked with, and I don't want to generalize across the whole world, but those are communities where a binary model of gender has been imposed through colonialism, and you can't just deconstruct that instantly, but definitely there are spaces for conversations. As for generation, I totally agree, and like all of these things, we have to kind of get to that nuance about where does generation fit in all of this, and how I think we had a presentation about young men being the targets of the police in Argentina, for example. When it comes to sexual violence, I would say, there are two basic targets. There's pretty boys and there are big men. And in the conflict-related sexual violence that I've seen, you get those two groupings. And, it seems, and this of course is just observation, but it looks like they're targeted for quite different reasons. The pretty boys because they're pretty, and the big men because they're powerful. And so you're doing something, the perpetrators are doing something different with those two different targets. And I also totally agree with the comment about psychology. I mean, I think this is yet another example of where, we have a sort of neo-colonial enterprise of providing mental health to survivors in the form of some kind of one-on-one counseling. And it doesn't actually do much. It can be a useful entry point for some individuals. But where we've seen much more kind of recovery and healing is where people get together in support groups and start to re-establish a sense that actually I can belong in a peer group. Because the big fear of most survivors is, and it's not just a fear, it's a lived experience, is that if people know, they will be excluded forevermore, and whatever position they had in the community, they will have lost it. So, finding ways to re-establish connectivity and belonging and position, including position and the chance of actually being a leader, or, those things really, really matter, because that's what has been taken away from you in part by some of these experiences of violence. And so the kind of the sociology of the impacts and tackling that is really, really central. The question about dealing with perpetrators who are also victims, I mean, there isn't a simple answer to that. And, I think if you've worked with survivors, many will say, how can I deal with knowing that my perpetrator is in this village? And so there are some pretty major hurdles to be overcome. But at the same time, when I worked with ex-combatants, not so much on sexual violence, but just on violence more broadly, this was in Mozambique many years ago, but between Frelimo and Renamo, the two sides in that particular conflict, those combatants, they understood each other. And they had an enormous amount of understanding for why the other side had done what they had done. Because as I said, we were all taken. Some were taken by that side, some were taken by the other side, but none of us really chose. But once we were there, we had to do what we had to do. And so there was a sort of common ground there which would allow them to start dealing. When you come to the sexual violence, I think it's much more complicated. And yeah, I don't want to get into individual stories about that. So I think I've answered some of them, not all of them.
Thanks very much. Montserrat, would you like to continue? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I would like to refer to some of the points, very interesting points that have been made by the audience. Of course, there is terrible violence against feminicide bodies or feminine bodies, or to all the people that do not fit the gender binary system. We didn't mention it, and we should have mentioned it, because that is a very, very present violence against the people. In Central America, we experience every day terrible violence against transgender people, and that violence is inflicted by the police and by other, systemic, actors that actually target this kind of people. The other thing that I want to say is that, of course, the gender system is colonial. I completely agree with the person that mentioned this, but we also have to recognize that it has developed a material reality. I mean, the gender system, because of the way it has imposed, has developed a material reality, and we live in this material reality that is actually producing all this kind of inequalities that we have mentioned in this session. So, of course, we have to criticize the way that the gender system was imposed, but we also have to recognize that it has a reality and that we need to address it. In the way, violence, develops in society, or is actually, organized, around these inequalities, I think we can see various coercive powers that we have to deal with all of them. And maybe I am talking about utopia, but I think we need to address, I'm going to go from the macro to the micro levels. Of course, the political economy that creates profound inequalities. And here we have discussed about the class and poverty and all that, and we have to address that. Of course, we have to address a racist and heteronormative system, which actually has renewed relations with the centers of colonial power. And we need to address then, these colonial powers that are reinforcing racist and heteronormative narratives. We have to address the state, because the state also generates violence and also generates tolerance and impunity to this violence. We have to address the organized crime industry and the other de facto powers that actually create, more violence in Central America. For instance, in Central America, we live in a condition in which many community leaders, indigenous leaders, women from those communities are being killed by those de facto powers. And I can give you the example of the assassination of Berta Cáceres, the indigenous leader that was assassinated by one of the companies that was creating a river dam. We also have traditional gender norms. We have talked about that. And also a model of masculinity, and I think we cannot deny that, a model of masculinity associated with control, with domination, and with honor. And when that type of masculinity is the prevalent masculinity in a particular society or region, we are going to have crimes produced as a result of this type of masculinity. And I also have to mention, because we haven't talked about it, that we now know that the pandemic, or the different pandemics, also generate more violence. We knew that from the Ebola pandemic in Africa. We know now that in Latin America, all the indicators in relation to violence against women, violence against young people, violence against transgender people increased during the pandemic. And we also need to address why is that pandemics also generate different types of crimes against the most vulnerable people. Thank you.
Henry, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, yes and no. So I think I'm not sure if I have a lot to add, but kind of maybe picking up on the question of the really difficult question of perpetrators and victims and dealing with that and transitional justice, and then also touching upon some of the other issues that were raised around the need to look at coloniality, age, going beyond the binary, all of which I absolutely agree with. I think one space to watch is the Colombian transitional justice process, where I think there, as imperfect as it is, there is a lot of attempts being made, especially by activists, by civil society, by also sort of activist academics, and by sympathetic bureaucrats in the system to really think through what does bringing in gender into this kind of a comprehensive transitional justice process look like, and looking at that in a context of a state which is all nation states pretty much are following the same kind of Western system that's based on a Western understanding of law and individuals. Everyone's theoretically the same in front of the law. In practice, they're not. But it is a very Western colonial concept. And then you have survivors of violence, victims of violence, who are from Afro-Colombian communities, who have a very different understanding of what bringing gender into that system looks like. It's not about making sure that there's 50-50 presentation of men and women, but have a more sort of intersectional, class-based approach to gender. Or then you have indigenous communities who don't see the individual in the same kind of way as the state sees the individual, and don't see gender in the same way as Western concept of gender see it as linked to the individual, but have a more community-based approach to it. So there's a lot that is happening there, and a lot of interesting. There's also it's one of the first transitional justice processes to really try and also grapple with what did the conflict mean to non-binary persons, to LGBTIQ communities and individuals, and again using an intersectional lens. So I think that there's a lot there to look at, to follow, and see what comes out of it. But I mean, it's going to be imperfect, and it's hugely difficult issues.
We are almost running out of time, so instead of taking more questions, I have a question to people on the panel, and that's kind of, you can associate that with a closing statement if you feel like it. But if you had the opportunity to design a research project on that topic, what would you do? What do you think the most pressing questions are for research in the area of gender and violence? Maria, would you like to start?
I think that I will go with gender inequality and different kind of sexisms, and I guess and how to probably. I think that I'll leave it there.
Sexisms is a term we haven't used yet, so yeah. Henry, what would you apply for? What project?
I think mine would probably be about, this is something I've been grappling with, is why is it that we as people hang on to impossible gender norms? And this is something actually that came out of reading, Chris, your work, where even in situations where it's impossible for women to live up to those expectations of femininity that are there, and men to live up to those expectations of masculinity, they don't go away. We don't just say, okay, let's forget about that, let's just do the best we can in this difficult situation, but they're actually reinforced and become stronger, and there's even more pressure to try and be the man or be the virtuous woman or whatever else is there. So where does that standing power of those norms come from?
Chris, your new research project?
I'm fascinated by numbers. I'm a qualitative researcher, but I'm constantly grappling with the fact that the numbers are completely inadequate, and yet they are deployed by policymakers to justify particular positions, particular perspectives, particular approaches, and they're clearly wrong. The numbers are wrong, and everything that comes out of those wrong numbers is wrong. So that would be where I would really want to explore more.
Okay. Montserrat, what would your next research project be in Ideal World?
Yes, thank you. I will focus on the perpetrators. I would like to understand why some people, under the same circumstances, the same context, the same family history or the same community history, exercise violence, and sometimes extreme forms of violence, and some other people coming from exact same context, the same situation and the same history do not.
Thank you. There are a lot of young academics, young scholars here in the room, so maybe you take some inspiration from these topics if you people here on the panel don't get the opportunity to number crunch or kind of work on your new research ideas. Thank you very much for being on this panel. I think what we've successfully managed is to kind of move out of kind of binary constructions, simple understandings of the relationship between gender and violence, to don't just make it more complex. I think that's always possible, but also to deepen the problem, unfortunately, without being able to suggest new ideas and kind of how to transcend some of these forms of violence, but maybe to open up some avenues in kind of which thinking about kind of reducing hierarchies, asymmetries between various forms of gender can potentially go in order to reduce the violence against anybody and everybody in that particular context. We said violence is always gendered, it's always relational, it's always intersectional, and there is a lot of it. So thanks very much for being here. And if I have read the program correctly, there is now an opening of an exhibition, and somebody will enlighten us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you, all speakers on the podium, and thank you, Chair. It was fantastic. And I have 3 announcements to make. Very short ones. The first is practical, the second is academic, and the third is material, and a small hint at the end. So, the practical one. Please return your headphones, well, I call them earphones, headphones and the receivers at the table when you leave our room. It is, well, Mrs. Wetzel told me it's outside the auditorium on the table where you just got it. Yeah, the second one and academic one, yes, there will be an opening of an exhibition. Halkano Vario and Absalom Aswani will just not giving papers, but they will just introduce their project of the exhibition to us. And there will be, I think, a very short comment of a co-fellow of Halkano, Joseph Mugere, to the exhibition. So the third one, material, I could also say culinary. I was told that there will be something to eat. Shortly after the opening of the exhibition. Well, and the hint, please don't forget, we have a 3rd day of our conference, and we will have again an early bird session tomorrow starting at 9. So thank you very much to all here in the room for a very inspiring day. And I think we could continue like that tomorrow. So have a good evening and a nice exhibition.